Tell her to leave through the service exit. She had owned the building for 6 days. He didn't know. Edmund Whitmore's voice fell over the ballroom like a sentence no one had expected to be read aloud. She did not answer him. What she could have said would have ended the gala immediately. Grace Miller's smile was the kind that arrives only when everything is already settled. The access cards had been deactivated at 9 that morning. Welcome back, boss. That is where this story ends. But stories do not begin at their endings, and understanding what those 7 moments mean requires knowing who Grace Miller was before the ballroom, who she became inside it, and what Richard Hale understood in the span of one quiet evening that he had never once stopped to consider. Before you hear how this ends, I want to ask you something. If quiet justice speaks to you, if you have ever stood in a room that pretended you were not there and known without needing to announce it exactly who you were, subscribe to this channel right now and leave me a comment below. Tell me, have you ever been dismissed by someone who later learned your name? Have you ever waited without bitterness long enough for the truth to speak for itself? I want to hear that story. I want to know you. Now, the gala, Tuesday evening, the lobby of the Hale Foundation mansion on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, where the chandeliers were turned up to their fullest brightness, and the champagne was very cold, and Richard Hale was, in all the ways that mattered, already finished. The ballroom of the Hale Foundation mansion had been designed to be impressive, and it succeeded without effort. 3 crystal chandeliers hung from a ceiling that had been painted by an artist Richard had flown in from Florence for the occasion and for the story it would make at dinner parties. The image was allegorical and vague, all light and ascending figures and the implication of something transcendent. Richard had described it in an interview with the Chronicle as a statement about aspiration. He had said this without irony, and the journalist had not introduced any. The walls were the particular shade of cream that interior designers charge extra to specify. The flowers, arranged by a team of 6 who had worked through the previous night, were white and structured, white peonies and lily of the valley, the kind that conveyed generosity in a language money had invented for itself. Their scent moved through the room at intervals, arriving and retreating, and several guests mentioned it to each other without knowing they were all saying the same thing. 212 guests moved through the space in the slow, deliberate orbit of people who understood that being seen was the point, that the charity was secondary to the architecture of the evening, and that Richard Hale was, tonight, the undisputed center of gravity around which all of it organized. He moved through the crowd the way people move when they have rehearsed the movement. A hand on a shoulder here, placed with the precision of a man who knows which shoulders welcome the gesture. A laugh produced on schedule there, the right duration, the right warmth, nothing excessive. A name remembered at precisely the right moment, deployed like a gift. "Senator, you look well." A pause to allow the senator to feel that he was the only person in the room, which was the effect Richard had perfected over 8 years of working rooms that required it. "David, your speech at the Bloomberg Summit, extraordinary, just extraordinary." The word extraordinary twice because once could be courtesy, and twice was emphasis, and emphasis, when distributed carefully, felt like sincerity. His tuxedo had been fitted 3 days prior. It was Italian, single-breasted, the kind of thing that did not announce itself. His cufflinks were his father's, gold, rectangular, simple. He had mentioned the cufflinks twice already, and the evening was young. The cufflinks did real work for him at events like this. They located him on the axis between inherited legitimacy and self-made achievement, which was the axis he had spent his career positioning himself on, even though his father had been an insurance broker in New Jersey and the cufflinks had been purchased at an estate sale in Connecticut 11 years ago. The detail, like most of the details of Richard Hale's public self, was not false in any strict sense. It was composed. The Corporate Stewardship Award sat on the stage at the far end of the room, inside a glass case that caught the light from the nearest chandelier and threw small prisms across the cream walls. Richard had arranged for it to be displayed before the ceremony, which was not standard practice, but was his preference, and his preference was the standard here. The award was an engraved crystal column, the kind that looks significant from a distance and reveals up close the generic quality of its inscription. for distinguished service to the business community and the city of New York. His name had been added in a smaller font below. He had looked at it for a long time when it arrived, alone in his office, the way a person looks at something they have wanted for a while and are now verifying. The catering staff moved in the periphery of the evening, in the practiced invisibility of people who have learned to be part of a room without being seen by it. White uniforms, name badges worn at the same height, silver trays carried level, footsteps tuned to the room's frequency. They were not part of the party. They were part of the room's mechanism, like the temperature control that kept the air at exactly 68 degrees, like the sound system that piped a string quartet through speakers positioned to make the music seem to come from everywhere and nowhere. Guests looked through them without hostility, without curiosity, without anything that required an adjustment in their attention, which was its own kind of erasure, and which everyone who wore the white uniform and worked those evenings understood, without discussing, because some things are understood entirely from inside them. Grace Miller moved among them with the same quietness she had carried through 22 months of early mornings and long evenings, and the particular internal calibration of someone who knows something the room does not and has decided for specific reasons to keep knowing it privately. She carried a tray of champagne flutes in her left hand, the tray level, and still her right hand free for adjustments. She navigated the clusters of guests with the efficiency that comes not from hurrying, but from reading a room accurately, knowing 3 steps in advance where a gap would open, where a group was about to disperse, where a guest had drifted toward the window and would want a refill before she thought to ask for one. She was good at the work. She had been, from the first week, better than the job required, not in a way that drew attention, but in the way of someone who cannot perform work at less than their full capacity because the habit of full attention was too deeply installed to suspend. Her father had been that way. She had inherited it without being taught it, the way some things are inherited not through instruction but through the example of watching someone live a certain quality of life for long enough that it becomes the only template you recognize. The table near the central pillar was assigned to the board members and their guests, 6 seats, each one occupied by someone whose name appeared in the financial press. Gerald Foster, who chaired the audit committee and who had known Richard for 11 years. The mayor's deputy, who was there because Richard had arranged for him to be there and for there to be a photograph. Grace set a fresh arrangement of champagne flutes on the service tray near the table's edge and reached to position 1 glass at the corner, placing it on the white tablecloth at the angle the placement diagram indicated, 1/2 inch. The flute landed 1/2 inch off the center line of the diagram. This would not have mattered, not under any reasonable calculus, not at an event where the flower arrangement alone had cost more than the annual salary of everyone in the catering team combined, not at a party where 212 people were occupied with the complex social mathematics of being seen by the right people in the right ways and had no attention available for the positioning of a champagne flute. It would not have mattered. It did not matter in any objective sense by any standard that a reasonable person would apply, except that Richard Hale turned at that moment. He was mid-laugh, a real laugh, or something close to it, a response to something the mayor's deputy had said. He turned to look at the table, the reflex of a host doing a constant ambient scan of his event, and his eyes found the tray, and they found the flute, and they found Grace standing behind it. He crossed the room without hurrying. That was the thing people noticed first, those who were watching, which was more people than Richard was aware of. Not the direction. The pace. It was the pace of a man who does not move quickly because he does not need to, the pace of entitlement so long established it has become a posture. He arrived at the table. He looked at the flute. He looked at Grace. He said nothing for a moment, which was a technique, the silence before the assessment, and which had the effect of making the nearby board members tighten almost imperceptibly in their chairs. "Is this how we're setting tables tonight?" His voice was not loud. It was the kind of voice that does not need volume to occupy space. The board member nearest him, Gerald Foster, shifted slightly in his chair. The shift was a small mechanical adjustment and had the quality of someone deciding very quickly that they were not going to be part of whatever came next. "I'm sorry, sir," Grace said. Her voice was level, not apologetic in the performed sense, not defensive. Level, the way a well-calibrated instrument reads level because that is what it is doing. Sorry doesn't fix the setting. He gestured at the table with an open hand, a gesture that indicated the whole arrangement, the entire surface, the entirety of her contribution to the evening. Look at this. You've got the flute off-center, the service napkin folded incorrectly, and the water glass is on the wrong side. The water glass was not on the wrong side. The service napkin was folded exactly as the diagram from the catering company specified. Only the flute was, by any honest measure, marginal. But accuracy was not the point. The point was something else, and everyone within earshot understood this immediately and made the rapid individual decision about how to relate to what they understood. I apologize, sir. I'll correct it. You'll correct it. He repeated the words with the slight elevation of someone who has found an error he intends to make instructive for a larger audience than the person directly addressed. He turned, fractionally, to face more of the room. His voice lifted just enough, not a shout, a performance that used the room's acoustics the way a good conductor uses the full width of an orchestra. Can someone explain to me how someone gets hired for this kind of event and doesn't know how a table is set? The laughter came from two directions. It was the uncertain kind, the kind that is less a response to humor than a question about which side of the moment to position oneself on. A press photographer near the stage had turned toward the sound. He was there to photograph the award ceremony, but he was also someone with a working eye, and the sound had the tonal quality of something worth watching. He did not lift his camera. Not yet, but he turned. Diane Hale stood 6 feet from Richard, holding a champagne flute with a precisely correct grip and wearing an expression that had been refined over the 2 years of their engagement into something that could function in moments like this one without displaying anything that could be used as a position later. She did not look at Grace. She looked at the middle distance between them, which was not a place, but a decision. Charles Okafor stood near the entrance to the service corridor, at the position he had occupied for 3 hours, hands clasped behind his back. He was the head of household at the Hale Foundation mansion, the person who had managed the physical functioning of this building for 9 years, who knew every pantry and every circuit breaker, and every staff member's name, and every guest's preference, and every vendor's reliability rating, and who was, in the economy of this kind of evening, as essential to its success as the chandelier engineer, and entirely less visible. He had known for 11 days what was going to happen in this room before the evening ended. Carrying that knowledge through the preparation of the event and the setup and the guest arrivals had required a quality of professional containment that had cost him something he could not have precisely named. He stood very still, he arranged his face, he closed his eyes. Just briefly, one breath. "I want her off the floor." Richard's voice had dropped back to its regular register, which made it somehow worse. "Now please, tell her to leave through the service exit, and contact the agency and have them send us someone who actually knows what a properly set table looks like." There was a beat. The particular beat of a room absorbing a public instruction directed at a specific person, which has the acoustic property of a held breath that everyone present is taking simultaneously without knowing it. Cora was stationed near the far window, holding a tray of drinks that had grown slightly warm while she was standing in place. She had worked alongside Grace for 16 months, through 14 events in this building and dozens more across the city, and she had come to know Grace the way you know someone you work beside without knowing them precisely, through the small accumulations of a shared shift, the way Grace folded a service napkin, the quiet efficiency of her when the kitchen was running behind, the fact that she never, not once in 16 months, complained out loud. Cora froze, not the dramatic freeze of theater, the internal invisible kind, the body receiving a signal that the mind has not yet fully processed and going still while it waits. She did not move toward Grace. There was no direction to move toward. There was nowhere to go. She would carry the stillness of that moment for a long time, the way you carry moments in which you did not act, not because you were cowardly, but because the situation did not have a geometry that contained action. Grace set the tray down on the service station with the same care she would have used at any other point in the evening. She straightened the champagne flute to the correct position. She did not look at Richard Hale. She did not look at the board members, at the mayor's deputy, at the press photographer, who had not yet lifted his camera. She looked briefly at nothing in particular, which is the expression of a person who is choosing very carefully, with the full weight of a decision they have rehearsed over 18 months, not to let the room see what is behind it. Then she walked, at exactly the pace she had walked all evening, toward the service corridor. Not quickly, not slowly. The pace of someone who has been here before and will be in the next room in a moment and does not require the room to mark her departure. Some people watched, most looked away. The photographer lowered his gaze. The board member, who had shifted in his chair, found something to study in his wineglass. The moment closed behind Grace like water closing behind a stone. Grace said nothing. What she could have said would have emptied the room in 30 seconds, and she had not yet decided when to say it. Richard Hale stood in the center of a ballroom he believed he owned. He was mistaken about that, as it turns out. He had been mistaken for exactly 6 days. Silence is not the same as patience, and patience is not the same as acceptance, and none of these things are the same as waiting for the precise moment when what you know becomes, in the room where it matters, publicly verified. Grace Miller knew the difference between all of them. She had learned it in stages, beginning before the conference room at 26 and extending through every Thursday morning between 7 and 7:45, through the east wing of a building that had once had her father's name above the lobby entrance. Dignity is not the absence of injury. It is the decision, made in the instant of the wound, about what to let the room see and what to carry privately. There are people who arrive at that understanding from books or from their mothers or from the slow accumulation of experience over decades of living in rooms that required it. Grace Miller arrived at it on a Tuesday afternoon in April, in a conference room on the 28th floor of a building that had once had her father's name on the door, in the presence of 2 lawyers and an agreement she did not want to sign, and signed anyway, because she was 26 years old and recently fatherless and operating with the wrong instruments for the situation she was in. The lesson was simple. The lesson was, come back with the right instruments, and come back when the room is full. Harold Miller had built Miller Industries from a single office on West 46th Street in Midtown, with a leaking roof, a single assistant named Patricia who stayed for 27 years, and the particular quality of stubbornness that distinguishes founders from managers. He was not a loud man, he was a precise one. He wore the same brand of suit for 30 years because he had found one that fit correctly and saw no reason to redirect attention from the work to the question of clothing. He drank his coffee black. He arrived before his staff and left after them, not to be seen doing this, but because the alternative felt to him like a failure of respect for the work itself. His wife, Eleanor, who died when Grace was 17, used to say that Harold had 2 modes, working and pretending to rest. He agreed with her. He did not change. By the year of his death, Miller Industries was worth $3.2 billion. It had divisions in commercial real estate, infrastructure financing, and a growing portfolio of mid-market acquisitions Harold had described in the one long interview he gave to the Chronicle as companies that have good bones and bad luck. He liked those. He fixed them. He gave them back their original names when he could. He believed companies with erased names lost something structural, not sentimental. He said so once, quietly, in a staff meeting. The room wrote it down. Several people years later could still quote the sentence exactly. He died on a Wednesday in March. Pancreatic cancer, diagnosed in November. He managed the diagnosis with the same compressed efficiency he brought to every other category of problem. He gathered information. He made decisions. He organized what could be organized. He told Grace in December over dinner, looking at her without deflection, giving her the information, and then waiting quietly for her to be ready to respond to it. He did not tell the board until February. He spent those months arranging what could be arranged, which was most things except the thing that mattered most. What came after him? Grace was 26. She had been working in the company's strategic development arm for 2 years, learning the business from inside it, the way Harold had always insisted. She was good at it. She had her father's quality of stillness, the kind that made rooms quiet around it and made people want to keep talking in hopes of getting more. Several of the senior staff, people who had known Harold for a decade or more, watched her in meetings and felt something they could not have entirely articulated, the recognition of a familiar quality in someone new. Richard Hale was VP of Finance. He had been with the company for 8 years, long enough to have been thoroughly evaluated and thoroughly trusted, and long enough to have mapped with considerable internal precision the full topology of the company's authority structure. He was organized. He was effective. He was the kind of executive who can present at a board meeting with total confidence and exit before anyone has precisely formulated the question that would have undone the presentation. Harold trusted him with the numbers because Richard's numbers were always clean. He was not the kind of man who stole from the books. He was the kind of man who understood what the books did not have to say and used that silence. Harold had seen something in him that he evaluated as competence, and that Richard had understood correctly as a runway. Within 3 months of Harold's death, Richard moved. The mechanism was legal and layered, and had the elegance of something planned rather than improvised. A faction of the board, 3 members whom Richard had cultivated over 2 years, voted as a coordinated bloc. Proxy votes, acquired through a subsidiary vehicle that Grace's lawyers identified 6 weeks too late, shifted the controlling balance. The legal maneuver that followed was obscure and entirely within the applicable statutes. When the motion cleared, Richard Hale held effective controlling interest of Miller Industries. Everything had been done correctly. Nothing had been done honestly. Grace's name was removed from the board, minutes that had mentioned her attendance and her contributions. It was not a dramatic removal. No one made a speech, no one ordered the purge explicitly. It was the quiet administrative erasure that happens when the people who control the records no longer have any reason to maintain the ones that don't serve them. The Founder's Wall, a small frame display near the lobby elevators that Harold had put up himself in the building's 3rd year because he was, in private ways he did not discuss, sentimental about where things began, was removed during a lobby renovation. The renovation was scheduled 3 weeks after the takeover. The contractor who removed the display did not know what it was. He was told it was decorative and outdated and should be disposed of. Grace was given a settlement. 7 figures. Non-disclosure. A 20-page agreement that her lawyers reviewed in 4 days and presented as the best available outcome given the mechanics of the vote and the timeline. She was 26, recently fatherless, and exhausted in the way of someone who has been fighting with the wrong weapons. She signed. For 2 years she watched from a distance, which was both the hardest thing she had done and the most necessary. She received reports from people inside the company who remembered her father and who trusted her, with the kind of information that does not appear in quarterly filings. She heard about vendors being systematically squeezed, their payment cycles extended from 30 days to 90 without negotiation. She heard about junior staff receiving title reductions without process, their compensation adjusted months later, and only slightly, the entire sequence normalized because normalization in institutions happens faster than anyone expects. She heard that the installation replacing her father's lobby display had been described by a critic as striking in its anonymity. She kept that sentence folded inside a small notebook, the same kind Harold had always used. Then one afternoon, sitting at a table in a coffee shop on West 53rd Street, the same block where she and Harold had eaten lunch on Fridays when she was learning the business, she opened her notebook and wrote a name at the top of a clean page. Meridian Capital, LLC. She applied for a cleaning position through a catering and facilities management company that held contracts with 14 major Manhattan properties, including, she verified before applying, the Hale Foundation Mansion and the Miller Industries headquarters building on Park Avenue. She applied under her mother's maiden name. She passed the background check without difficulty. She wanted to see what Richard had done to what her father built, not from the distance of financial filings and investor communications, from the floor, from the vantage point of people who are overlooked and who know, because of it, more than the institution suspects. She saw corners cut on the cleaning contracts. She saw junior staff addressed in language that had become, through repetition, the building's ambient standard. She saw a small printing company that had supplied Miller Industries since Harold's 3rd year, Wait 93 days for a payment the contract specified at 30. She cleaned Richard Hale's office every Thursday morning between 7 and 7:45. Before the executive floor arrived, she emptied his wastebasket. She dusted his credenza. She moved around the perimeter of the room with the practiced invisibility of her trade, noting how he had redecorated it. The thoroughness of a man who wanted to be recognized as the author of something, not the inheritor. He never once looked at her. She had not come to be seen. She had come to see. Meridian Capital LLC had been incorporated in Delaware 18 months before the Gala, through an attorney named James Oba, a partner at a firm that had represented Harold Miller in his personal legal matters for 22 years, and who had, since Harold's death, maintained a private loyalty to his daughter that no formal obligation required. The structure Oba designed was not unusual. It was a holding company with several sub-vehicles, which was standard architecture for the kind of investment strategy that required patience and discretion above speed and visibility. What made it remarkable was not its structure, but its operator and her intent. Grace had spent 2 years doing two things simultaneously. She had been watching the company from outside, accumulating intelligence that would have been impossible to gather from inside it. And she had been watching the market around the company, with the focused attention of someone who understood that a hostile acquisition executed at speed under the cover of grief creates distortions that the market corrects slowly. She understood the share structure as a map of who held what and why and under what conditions they might let it go. She understood which institutional holders were passive, which were patient, and which were tired. And she understood the one moment, 9 months out, when a block of shares held by one of Harold's earliest outside investors would become available through an estate liquidation the family had neither the legal energy nor the financial need to contest. The transactions were dispersed across 11 sub-vehicles, each purchased below SEC disclosure thresholds. The board received no alerts. The market did not move. The business press mentioned Meridian Capital exactly once in a roundup of mid-market activity as an unnamed Delaware-based vehicle in a quiet accumulation. The journalist who wrote that sentence was working on a different story and did not follow up. The board never connected the initials in G. Miller, Meridian Capital, principal owner, with the maid named Grace, who worked the East Wing on Thursday mornings. They could not have been expected to. The connection required holding two categories in mind simultaneously: that the building, as an institution, had never been organized to consider as belonging to the same category at all. The woman who cleaned the executive offices. The woman who might own them. These were not in the mental architecture of the people who moved through that building in suits and title badges, members of the same species of human possibility. This was not malice, it was structure. Which is sometimes worse. Only Edmund Whitmore knew. Edmund had been chairman of the Miller Industries board for 19 years. He had known Harold since before Miller Industries existed, since the year Harold had a single office with a leaking roof and was courting the first board member he would ever recruit, and had called Edmund, who was then at a financial firm with a reputation for backing people rather than positions, and said, without preamble, "I need someone who can see farther than the quarter." Edmund had come to the meeting. He had stayed for 19 years. He had watched the hostile acquisition with the private fury of a man who understood exactly what had happened and did not, at that specific moment, have the votes to stop it. He had gone to the emergency session, voted no, recorded his dissent, and left the building thinking about the word yet. He had learned, from a contact who knew James Oba, that a Delaware holding vehicle with initials he recognized was accumulating shares in Miller Industries with unusual discipline. He said nothing. He watched it proceed with the attentiveness of someone watching a chess game from outside the board. One player building a position the other has not yet understood is being built. His phone rang at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday evening. He was in his study. Grace's voice was the same as he remembered it from her childhood, which was also her father's voice, that quality of containment that made you lean forward to hear it, not because it was quiet, but because it was specific. "Edmund." "Yes. You know why I'm calling." A pause. not hesitation. Edmund Whitmore did not hesitate as a general practice. The pause was its own form of acknowledgement, the kind that says, I do know, I have been waiting. I am ready. You have 51%. His voice was low, not congratulatory, because the moment was too significant and too long in coming for a register as light as congratulation. The tone of a man for whom something important has been completed. I know. Another pause, longer, the kind that holds more than silence, the kind that holds a long chain of Tuesday evenings and vote counts and documents and patience and the specific cost of waiting without being certain that the waiting will arrive at what you are waiting for. When are you coming back? She took a moment before answering, not because she did not know the answer, because she had been waiting to say the answer for a long time, and the waiting had given the words a weight that she wanted to let arrive correctly. When the moment is right, he said nothing more. He did not ask when. He had known Harold Miller long enough to understand that the Miller family's sense of timing was not impatience dressed as certainty, but certainty that had done the work of understanding exactly when the lever would move the thing that needed moving. He trusted the calibration he already understood. 3 days before the gala, at a board lunch in the second-floor dining room of the Miller Industries headquarters, Richard Hale had made a calculation he described to himself as elegant, and that was, in fact, merely the latest in a series of small cruelties that he had mistaken over time for management. The lunch had been catered by the same company that supplied the gala. Grace had been assigned to the service team. A board member, a man named Calder, who had joined the board in Richard's second year as CEO, and who had the conversational habit of amplifying whatever the most senior person in the room said until it became a position, had made a comment about the inadequate warmth of the bread rolls. It was a mild comment, the kind that a room of reasonable adults would register and move past. Richard amplified it. He addressed Grace by the wrong name, twice deliberately. The mispronunciation maintained with the consistency of someone who has decided that accuracy is optional in this direction. He suggested to the room that perhaps the catering company's standards had declined, a general observation that was, in its phrasing, directed at a specific person. Grace said nothing. She replaced the bread rolls. She continued the service through the meal and through the dessert course and through the coffee service, and she did it with the same quality of attention she brought to all of it, because the quality of her attention was not conditional on the behavior of the room she was serving. Richard had gone to his assistant afterward and told her to have Grace removed from the catering roster. This was done by end of day, then he reversed it. He called the catering company's client manager the following morning and said he wanted the full team for the gala, including the woman from Thursday's lunch. He was specific. He used a description that identified her without naming her. He said it with the lightness of someone arranging a detail that gives them a private satisfaction they do not need to explain. He told Diane that evening at dinner in the same light tone. She'll be working the floor while I accept the award. He arranged his expression into something that implied he found this amusing, which was the expression he used when he wanted to communicate that he was in control of something and did not need to be acknowledged as being in control of it. Let her come. Let her see what she lost. Diane had produced the specific syllable she produced in response to things she chose not to have a position on. His speech was prepared. 4 minutes, no teleprompter. He had written it himself over the course of 3 evenings, the draft on the desk, the revision in the morning. He had practiced it in his bathroom mirror the morning of the gala and the morning before. He felt it was good. He felt the balance between gratitude and vision was correctly calibrated, that the acknowledgement of the Foundation's charitable work was sufficient without being excessive, that the personal note about his own history was placed at the right moment and had the right duration. He had used the word stewardship 3 times in 4 minutes, which was intentional. He stood in his bathroom at 6:15 and said the opening line to his own reflection. What we build in this city. He paused as he had rehearsed the pause. He said it again. Earlier, on Fifth Avenue, his tailor had completed the final adjustment to his lapels. Richard had stood very still for the adjustment and had spoken fragments of the speech under his breath while the assistant worked. The assistant, a young man who had developed, through 4 years of the work, a talent for disappearing in plain sight, heard every word. He did not appear to. The tuxedo was excellent. The cufflinks caught the light when Richard moved. He looked in his mirror like the version of himself he had been building toward since the moment he arrived at Miller Industries 8 years ago, with a clean presentation and a longer plan. A version that had no prior. Across the city on the 32nd floor of a building in Midtown that Grace had purchased the previous spring through a separate vehicle, one she had funded before Meridian was established, and that served purposes that extended beyond a single acquisition. She sat at a clean table in a private office that contained what it needed and nothing else. Her assistant, a woman named Linda, who was the third person in New York who understood the full shape of what was about to happen, had placed a folder on the table at 4:50 that afternoon and slid it across. Confirmed this morning, Meridian's majority position is of record as of 9 a.m. Grace read the page once. She read it the way her father had read documents, with the complete attention of someone who is looking not for reassurance but for accuracy, and who finds when the accuracy is confirmed that their expression does not change because they already knew this was what it said, and the document is not new information but the official form of information they have been holding for some time. She set the document down. She folded her hands on the table. Linda waited. She was good at waiting. It was one of the things that made her useful. "Thank you, Kiestein," Grace said. "The board session is confirmed for 4 this afternoon." "Good." Linda paused. "Edmund sends his regards." Grace nodded. "Once." The nod that contains more than the movement itself, that has been saved for a specific moment and arrives weighted with everything that preceded it. Elsewhere in the building, a memo had gone to 3 members of the executive floor, sent from an address that would not have been in anyone's regular contacts. It read, "Ownership protocol briefing, end of Gala. You will receive further instruction from the chairman's office." The 3 people who received it read it once and understood it, and went about the remaining hours of the afternoon with the focused efficiency of people who have been given a specific task and who know exactly when the task begins. Charles Okafor, at his station near the main entrance of the Hale Foundation mansion, had reviewed his guest flowchart at 3 o'clock that afternoon with a thoroughness he did not usually apply to the final document review, because the final document review is usually a formality after the event has been planned and set. He had made one amendment to the chart, a single name, moved from one category to another. Grace Miller, not under catering staff, not under event operations, but under principal guests. He had printed the chart himself on the office printer rather than having it prepared by the events coordinator. He had folded it once and placed it in his breast pocket where it stayed against his chest for the entire evening. He had known for 11 days. He had said nothing to Richard Hale, nothing to the household staff, nothing to the catering coordinator or the events management team. He had carried the knowledge with the particular compression of a professional whose entire career had been built on making complex information look simple. He had understood when he was told that the most important evening he would ever manage was the one he was now preparing. He had prepared it with the care that understanding deserved. When Grace arrived for her shift at 5:30, she and Charles had exchanged a look across the entry hall that lasted less than 2 seconds and contained everything that needed to be contained in it. Grace arrived at the Hale Foundation mansion for the second time that evening at 8:47 in the evening. She came through the main entrance. She had not been on the catering roster since Richard removed her and then reinstated her, and the reinstatement she had confirmed that morning was no longer in effect. She had no shift to work. She came as herself. She wore a dark structured jacket, charcoal, cut well and without ornament. No jewelry. Flat shoes, the same flat shoes she had worn for 22 months of early mornings. Her hair was pulled back in the way she had kept it for 2 years. The same style she had worn on the afternoon she walked into the 28th floor conference room to sign the agreement she did not want to sign. She had not changed it, not as a statement, not as a deliberate continuity, but because she had not been, in those 22 months, performing a version of herself that required a different presentation. She had been herself, the complete version, wearing a service badge and carrying a tray and cleaning the offices of a building she was in the process of reacquiring. The version and the context had simply not matched in a way the building was equipped to notice. Charles Okafor was at the door. He saw her on the steps before she reached the entrance, and he straightened. A small, precise movement, nothing that could be called theatrical, the deliberate reconfiguration of a man who has been in a state of professional performance all evening and who is now shifting into something that has personal meaning attached to it. "Good evening, Miss Miller." Her real name, the name on her father's wall, the one that had been removed during the renovation, her name. "Good evening, Charles." He moved to guide her through the main doors, and this movement was noticed by the guests near the entrance because it was anomalous. Charles Okafor did not personally escort guests. Charles Okafor managed the entry process, directed staff, coordinated the flow of 212 guests through a sequence of arrival that had been planned and documented. He was the system, not a person in the system. And he was escorting someone, walking beside her, adjusting the pace to hers, moving with the particular attentiveness of someone performing a function that matters. The three people nearest the entrance, a board member and his wife and a journalist from the Chronicle who had been about to step outside for a phone call, all registered the small choreography. They turned. They looked. Grace moved through the gilded corridor that connected the main entrance to the ballroom with the same unhurried pace she had used all evening. Not the pace of someone making an entrance, the pace of someone arriving at a place they have been before and belong to and have been patient about the matter of returning to. The ballroom was at its density. The ceremony was 30 minutes out, and the room had reached the state where conversations overlapped, and the combined sound of 212 individual performances of social ease created a volume that had texture. Parce qu'elle de l'idestécher fait the particular chord of a formal evening at its height. The chandeliers were at their fullest. The flowers were still exactly as they had been arranged at 6 that morning. Richard Hale was at the center of the room, mid-sentence with the mayor's deputy, the conversation running well on the fuel of a topic Richard had specifically prepared for. He was 4 sentences into the infrastructure point when he turned, the habitual scan of a host monitoring his room, and he saw Grace. His sentence stopped. Not with a visible break, not with a sound the mayor's deputy immediately noticed, but it stopped. The way a machine stops when a specific signal interrupts it, mid-clause, suspended. He looked toward the entrance. His expression moved through 3 phases in the span of approximately 2 seconds. The first was confusion, the specific confusion of seeing something in a space where it does not belong, according to your complete and certain map of the space. The second was dismissal, the reflex of a man whose map of reality is very confident. He told himself in the fraction of a second available that he was misreading the situation, that this was not what it looked like, that everything was as he had arranged it. The third phase was reconfusion, which arrived when the second look found the same thing the first look had found, unchanged. He was about to move toward her. Edmund Whitmore entered. The room knew Edmund before it saw him. That was the particular quality of authority that takes 19 years to build. It arrives slightly ahead of the person. The board members felt it first, the adjustment in atmospheric pressure that experienced rooms feel when someone enters who does not need the room to confirm their standing. Gerald Foster set his drink on a passing tray. Margaret Chew shifted her weight to her right foot. 2 younger executives near the stage noticed that the people they were talking to were no longer fully present in the conversation. Edmund was 63. He had the quality of stillness that comes not from restraint, but from the complete absence of the need to perform. He moved through the room the way water finds its level without apparent effort at exactly the speed of his own decision. He was early. Edmund Whitmore was never early. He arrived at events with the calibrated punctuality of someone who considers both lateness and earliness to be impositions on other people's time. He was not supposed to be here yet. Several of the board members, registering his presence before they registered his direction, made rapid and private calculations about what his being early meant. Edmund crossed the ballroom. He passed Richard Hale, who was 3 feet to the right of his path. He did not pause. Not without seeing Richard, because Edmund noticed everything, without stopping. The microscopic social injury of a pass without acknowledgement by the chairman of the board was absorbed by the 12 people near enough to witness it and would be discussed in quiet voices before the evening was over. He reached Grace Miller. He took her hand in both of his. He kissed the back of her hand once with the formal correctness of a man performing a gesture that has a specific meaning in the register where he operates. Not a greeting between people who know each other, a recognition, a formal acknowledgement, public and deliberate, of someone whose standing required a public and deliberate act to establish. The phones appeared, not all at once, in the wave pattern of a crowd responding to something that arrives visually as significant before anyone has processed why it is significant. The silence fell the same way, in sections from the edges of the room inward, like a row of objects falling toward a single center. The string quartet, playing through a speaker system positioned to be unobtrusive, continued for a moment past the point where anyone was still hearing it. Then someone, near the sound system, turned it down. The room was quiet in the way that rooms are only quiet when something is about to be said that everyone, without being told so, understands they need to hear. Richard Hale crossed the room. He had to. The mathematics of social physics, which he had understood and operated through for 20 years, did not leave him an alternative. Not crossing would have been a statement, and every possible version of that statement was a version he could not afford. He crossed at his normal pace, which cost him something real. His normal pace was the pace of a man whose authority filled the room, and the room had just changed its configuration in a way that his pace had not yet caught up with. He arrived at the edge of the small geography that Edmund and Grace occupied. He arranged his face into the professional warmth he used on difficult clients, the expression that costs something to maintain and that serves the function of buying time. He looked at Edmund first. Edmund looked at the middle distance. His expression did not close and did not open. It was present and complete and entirely unhelpful. "I think there may be some confusion about tonight's guest list." Edmund said nothing. "Richard," Grace's voice arrived at the temperature the ballroom's air conditioning maintained throughout the evening. 68 degrees, consistent, calibrated, deliberate, not cold in the way of anger. Cold in the way of a precision that has been operating at this temperature for a long time. "I'm not sure who arranged your invitation," Richard continued, and he had produced an additional layer of warmth in his voice now, the extra warmth of someone whose first move has not worked and who is moving to the second, "but perhaps we can find you a seat somewhere." "Richard," the word stopped him, not the volume, which had not changed, the word itself. She said his name, the way you say the name of a person you are about to tell something they cannot unhear, with the specific quality of finality that belongs to sentences before they are spoken. "I own this building." He laughed. It was brief and controlled, the duration of a door being closed. "I think you mean your catering company." "No." One word. She let it land. She did not hurry past it. A pause. The kind that, in a room of 212 people who were no longer pretending to be engaged in other conversations, has the quality of a very long time. "I think you mean exactly what I said." The crowd had stopped. Not with a signal, not through any coordinated decision, but in the accumulated way of a room that understands it is witnessing something that is not entertainment, something that is real, and that real things require a different posture than entertainment. They had all turned, or turned enough. Cora, who had found her way to the edge of the ballroom, was holding her tray very still, her expression doing the careful work of someone whose understanding of a situation is being revised in real time, and who does not yet have the vocabulary for the revised version. Richard's smile had acquired the quality of a fixed thing, held in place by the muscle below the feeling. He looked at Edmund with the expression of a man expecting a rescue that he believes he has been promised and that has not yet arrived. It was the look of a genuine expectation, which made it harder to witness than a look of pretense would have been. Edmund looked at Grace. He gave the smallest possible nod, a movement so contained that it could have been missed from across the room. It was not missed from where Richard was standing. "5 words, Richard." Her voice was exactly the same temperature it had been since she first spoke. Not louder, not harder, not warmer, the same calibrated consistency she had maintained for 22 months and for the 18 months before that in Delaware offices and attorneys' meetings and conversations at 11 o'clock on Tuesday evenings. I own this company. The silence afterward was a different substance from the silence before it. The silence before had been the absence of sound. This silence was something present. It was the sound of 212 people simultaneously revising their understanding of the room they were standing in and finding that the revision required more time than was immediately available. Edmund Whitmore turned to face the room. He did not raise his voice. He had not raised his voice in a professional context since the mid-2000s, and he had been correct in that instance that the raised voice was warranted. He did not need to raise it now, his voice carried by the authority of 19 years in a position that required, above all other qualities, that when he spoke, the speaking was understood to be mandatory. The room that had been murmuring completed its silence. "Ladies and gentlemen," he paused, not dramatically, with the professional precision of a man who is giving the room the time it needs to be ready for what it is about to hear. "Effective this morning, Meridian Capital LLC, principal owner Grace Harold Miller holds 51.3% of Miller Industries' outstanding shares. The board confirmed the transfer at an emergency session held this afternoon." He paused again. He looked at Grace. He looked at her the way he had once looked at her father, in a room that was nothing like this one, when Harold had shown him the lease on the West 46th Street office and said, without fanfare, "This is where it starts." Edmund had believed him. He believed her now. Grace Miller is the majority owner of this company. He did not hurry the final words. He did not soften them. He said them the way a sentence is said when it has been earned and waited for, and verified, and is now, finally, public. "Welcome back, boss." The room moved. The inner circle first. The board members who had attended the afternoon session, whose faces were completing the work of transitioning from known information into public position. Then the press, the photographers, and the journalist from the Chronicle who had come for an award ceremony and received instead something that was going to require different verbs. The flashes began, small punctuation marks of light, irregular, arriving in clusters. Several phones appeared to transmit images in real time. The ballroom, designed to make its host look powerful, was in the process of recording something that was not about its host. Grace turned to Richard. He was standing very still. The smile had gone entirely. What replaced it was an expression that had no professional register, no practiced version. It was the expression of a man who has, in a single moment, understood the full shape of something he had been inside without seeing. The whole architecture of the past 22 months, the Thursday mornings, the East Wing, the champagne flute, the service exit, the board lunch, the calculated reinstatement, the bathroom mirror, and the speech he had written himself. He was understanding all of it at once, which is not a comfortable kind of understanding. "Your access cards were deactivated at 9 this morning." Her voice had not changed. Not triumphant, not soft, not warm, not cruel. The voice of a fact stated at its correct temperature, which is the temperature of administrative reality, the temperature of a thing that has happened and is irreversible and does not require an emotional register to accompany it. She took a champagne flute from the tray of a server who had paused nearby, who had the small, precisely contained expression of someone who has been part of this evening in ways that the guests had not registered. She held the glass. She did not drink from it. She held it the way her father had held a pen in long meetings, not to write with, but to give the hand something to anchor the rest of the body to. "The legal team is in conference room B." She did not glance toward the corridor, which meant she did not need to. She had known where conference room B was since she was a child, since the first time Harold had brought her to the building on a Saturday and walked her through every floor. "Ah, they have the standard severance package prepared." A pause. The last pause of the evening, the one that gathered all the previous pauses into itself. "You may leave through the service exit." The three people who had laughed, or produced something adjacent to a laugh at 8:42, when Richard performed his authority at the board table, looked at each other in the specific way of people who need to know whether the other people noticed that they laughed, and found that everyone had noticed, and found that there was nothing useful to do with their faces. One of them set her glass down with extreme care. One of them located something in the ceiling that required sustained examination. One of them excused himself to use the restroom and was not seen again until the evening had resolved into something else. Diane left first. She did not announce it. She collected her wrap from the coat check with the efficient composure of a woman who had, some time before this moment, arrived at a decision and was now simply executing it in the appropriate order. She walked to the main exit, the one where the foyer light fell across the stone steps, and she did not look back at the room she was leaving. Several people saw her go. The people who had watched her expression across the previous 3 hours understood immediately what her leaving meant and were not surprised. She was in a car that was not Richard's within 4 minutes. Marcus Way, who had known Richard since before Miller Industries and who had called Richard that morning at 10:15 to hear his account of the Maid situation and who had listened with the careful neutrality of a man who already possesses the relevant information and is waiting to observe whether the other man will arrive at it, had attended the emergency board session that afternoon. He had voted yes. He had done so with the quiet steadiness of someone who has been waiting for a vote that aligns his practical interests with his sense of what is correct and who finds the alignment when it arrives, something close to relieving. He was near the stage when Edmund spoke. When the room began moving, he did not look at Richard. He looked at Grace. He held his glass with both hands, and he nodded once to himself, which was the private acknowledgement of a man completing a long internal accounting. Richard's name was still on the door of the CEO's office the following morning, on the placard installed 18 months prior in the particular typeface Richard had approved because it communicated permanence. It was there at 7 when he arrived because he had nowhere else to go, and the office had for 8 years been the place where he understood who he was. It was there at 8. At 9:15 the maintenance crew arrived. 2 people and a cart carrying the specific tools for removing placards from doors without damaging the surface beneath. Richard was at his desk. He had been at his desk since 7 and had not been doing anything in any definable sense. There were no meetings on his calendar. His calendar had been placed in administrative hold at 9 o'clock, which happens when the person whose calendar it is no longer has the access credentials to review it. He had known when he sat down at 7 that the morning was going to contain something like this. He had not been able to stop himself from coming anyway. The office was where he knew who he was, and he had needed very badly to know who he was. The maintenance crew did not speak to him. They positioned the cart with the economy of people who have done this before and who have a schedule. They removed the placard. It came away from the door cleanly because whoever had installed it had used the correct adhesive, which was a small detail of craftsmanship that Harold Miller would have appreciated without comment if the placard had been his. Richard watched them carry it out of the office and down the corridor. He did not stand. He did not speak. He did not move to stop them, because stopping them would have been a statement, and every version of that statement was a statement about a position he no longer held. There was nothing to say. He had learned, in the span of a single evening, the lesson that 8 years of inhabiting that office had never required him to learn, that arrogance is not a quality of the self, but a transaction with an audience. That authority is a story a room agrees to tell, and when the room revises its understanding, the story ends, not in a confrontation, not in a defeated speech, not in any moment that could be recorded and analyzed later, but in 2 people with a cart and a correctly applied adhesive and a door that looks exactly the same with the placard and without it. The audience had left. Somewhere across the city, in the 32nd floor office of a building in Midtown that Grace had purchased quietly the previous spring, she sat at her father's old desk. She had moved it out of storage herself, not because she could not have arranged for it to be moved, because she had needed to carry it with her own hands. There are things whose weight you need to know personally and cannot know any other way. The desk was mahogany, old enough to have developed the warmth that comes not from finish but from presence, from hands resting on its surface through long afternoons and coffee cups finding their familiar positions and leaving over the years the faint pale rings Harold had never bothered to treat because he cared about the work, and the rings were evidence of the work. Grace had looked at them the first morning and placed her own cup in the position of the largest ring. She looked at the city through glass her father had chosen. Floor to ceiling facing south, the city spread below the window in the particular configuration of lower and midtown Manhattan that you can only see from this height and this direction. The grid going south toward the harbor, and east toward the bridges, and west toward the river. The whole complicated logic of the place visible all at once in a way that makes it, briefly, comprehensible. The light in the morning, her father had told her once, when she was perhaps 12 and visiting the office on a school holiday, comes in at the angle that makes you believe in what you are doing. It was the only sentimental thing she had ever heard him say about the space. She had remembered it for 20 years without knowing she was remembering it. She had known, when she arranged the purchase of this building, without examining the knowledge, that the southern exposure at this height was part of what she was purchasing. On the corner of the desk was a folded white uniform and a service badge. She had placed them there herself before she sat down, setting them in the corner where the desk met the wall, not as a trophy, not as a relic of something survived, as a reminder of the actual cost of what she had done, not the money which had been assembled through discipline and correct analysis, and the kind of patience that looks from the outside like caution. Not even the time, though 22 months of Thursday mornings at 7 a.m., and 16 months of galas and board lunches, and the specific experience of serving champagne in a room full of people who look through you as though you were part of the temperature control, is a particular category of cost that should not be minimized. The actual cost was simpler and harder to name. It was the daily decision. Not once, not at the beginning when conviction is easy, but every day in every room, the decision to remain precisely yourself when the room was offering you a version of yourself that was smaller and easier to categorize. To hold the knowledge and carry the tray, to know the building and clean the floor, to own the name and wear another one, not with resentment, not with performance, but with the straightforward integrity of someone who has decided what this requires and is doing it. That is what the uniform and the badge meant on the corner of the desk. They were the account, the full and honest account of what it had cost, because power dressed in silence had always been the most dangerous kind. Not the power that announces itself in acceptance speeches rehearsed in bathroom mirrors and in the specific font chosen for a door placard and in the weight given to inherited cufflinks. Not the power that builds its authority on the assumption that the people it passes through rooms without seeing are simply not worth considering. Not the performance of power, which requires an audience and collapses when the audience understands what it has actually been watching. Just the kind that waits and prepares and returns, the kind that, in the end, only has to arrive.